Marina Kozina, on a comprehensive analysis of household perspectives in EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe.
Hi, good afternoon. Maria Kozina.
Maria.
So in this presentation, I will show you a statistical portrait of the economic conditions of households in Eastern European countries part of the EU and compare them with the European Union and the Euro area averages. I want to give you a very brief background regarding the methodology because I believe it's important to quickly understand the national accounting framework of the accounts used to derive the key indicators. They permit analysis of disposable income and the accumulation of wealth in households. The indicators shown in the presentation focus on households' disposable income and non-financial and financial wealth, and they're listed for you here in the slide. What are institutional sector accounts? They are data from a national accounting domain, and they're compiled according to a common methodological framework called ISA 2010. This common framework ensures consistency as it allows for a broad national financial and non-financial statistical comparisons. All the data series that you'll see in the presentation are derived from sector accounts. Many key economic indicators are derived from these accounts for households, and a number of analytical ratios can be derived to explain households' economic activities. We combine financial and non-financial data, and in that way we make an integrated study of households' non-financial economic activities as well as financial transactions. Data on sector accounts are very rich in information and they're very detailed. Experienced users use them for macroeconomic analysis and in the EU for policy making, but less experienced users can find them very difficult to synthesize because they have so much information. Non-financial sector accounts describe economic transactions, from production to the distribution of income, the distribution of consumption, savings, and investment. The balancing items of these accounts that are most relevant for the households which we're analyzing are gross disposable income and gross saving. Financial accounts, on the other hand, record the net acquisition of financial assets and the net incurrence of liabilities. They make it possible to compute the financial assets and liabilities and the net financial worth of households. Households also own non-financial assets, which are primarily homes. Wealth is essentially the value of these, plus financial assets that generate income, minus any financial liabilities. For recent years, ESA guarantees the availability of at least some estimates for housing wealth. These are produced from available non-financial assets. Unlike data on financial assets, national account statistics for non-financial assets has just very recently been introduced. We use data on land and dwellings as a proxy for what we call real wealth. Housing wealth is the main component of this proxy that we call real wealth. So a good housing wealth estimate is essentially key to assessing household non-financial assets and therefore the total assets that a household has. Where data are missing, because this is a relatively new key statistic that has become available, we have made estimates to complete the picture on financial assets, on what we call real wealth. And we've also made estimates to compute the EU and the EA aggregates. The way in which by the methodological framework in which these statistics are organized, the aggregated areas are not flows between each other and the rest of the world. So the total value can be calculated with no risk of duplication. So the estimates for the EU and the EA are very simply by adding up all the countries that are used in the analysis. In this figure, we want to show you real non-financial wealth as a proportion of total wealth for the analyzed countries, for the EU and the EA. It's basically to show the weight of non-financial wealth in total wealth, which we can see is more than 1/2. As a reminder, we used the sum of land and dwellings as a proxy for real wealth. When we looked at this, we found that in most of the analyzed countries, non-financial assets make up a greater proportion of the total net wealth, and to a bigger extent than they do in the EU and the EA. This could mean that there's a clear preference in these countries for household investment in real rather than financial assets. I wanted to speak a little bit more about methodology, but I'm going to skip this because it doesn't really affect the results, the indicators that I'm going to show you. So moving on to the first indicator, here we have household gross saving rate, where B8G is the gross savings, D8 is the adjustment for change in pension, and B6G is the gross disposable income. Disposable income is the amount of resources that accrue to households in a given period as a result of their activity of suppliers of labor or capital minus taxes. Savings is disposable income less consumption or final consumption expenditure after the adjustment for pension funds. We need to make this adjustment to make the change in pension entitlements on which households have a definite claim appear in the household savings. The gross household saving ratio captures households' relative allocation of their income flows to savings over the period. This is the proportion of income that is not consumed, and it's expressed as a percentage of disposable income. So overall here we can see that the saving rates of the analyzed countries are much lower than the EU and the EEA averages. They diverged significantly, and then they seem towards the end of the period analyzed to converge a little bit more to the EU and the EEA averages. If we look at this by countries, all of the analyzed countries except Slovenia, excluding in 2003 and 2012, show saving rates that are generally below the EU and the EEA average. Hungary's rate are relatively high, above the EU average in the recent years. By contrast, Bulgaria and Romania for the available years have negative rates. Latvia also has negative rates between 2001 and 2014, and Estonia in 2002 to 2007, before it increases and starts approaching the EU average from 2009 onwards. Another indicator, the non-financial gross investment rate, captures the flow of capital formation such as purchases and improvements to housing. It is expressed as a percentage of disposable income. In the numerator, P51G is non-financial investment, which we call gross capital fixed formation. For households, this is mainly investments in their homes and dwellings and land. Similarly to the saving rate, the investment rate measured with respect to disposable income is lower for the total of the countries analyzed than the EU and the EEA averages. However, they converge even more than what we saw in the saving rate before, in the later periods. Looking at it by country, Czechia shows levels comparable to the EU average and even higher from 2008 onwards. Recent years, household investment rates have exceeded these averages in Romania, with Estonia, Czechia, Poland, Slovakia just below. The investment rate in Estonia peaked noticeably, you see the purple line, in 2005 to 2007 on the left side. Czechia, Latvia, and notably Romania saw a sharp increase in 2007. Slovenia's rate moved away from the EU average in 2001 to 2009, following a decline, and then converged on the average there afterwards. The household investment to GDP ratio reflects the proportion of GDP used for gross investment rather than consumption. Like the investment rate, the measure with respect to disposable income, it is lower for the analyzed countries and then seems to converge thereafter slightly to the averages. And if we look at it by country, we see the exact same picture that we saw when we compared investment to disposable income. Estonia, Czechia, Poland, Slovakia are just below. The same very big peak that you saw in Estonia before is evident here as well. The same sharp increases in Czechia, Latvia, and Romania are again seen here. Households' gross debt-to-income ratio measures the main source of indebtedness of households as a percentage to their disposable income. It's based on the stock of loan liabilities, AF4 liab, you see in the numerator. This indicator diverges the most from the EA average. The EU is not available for this indicator. The level of indebtedness is markedly lower in the Eastern European countries analyzed. This indicator is much lower in the first part of the period, 2001 to 2005, and it approaches a bit the euro area in 2006 to 2011. Decreases then again after 2012, but to a level much higher than we saw compared to the beginning of the period. Estonia has the highest ratio, while Latvia and Bulgaria are among the lowest. This indicator is on the rise for Poland for the available years, Czechia, and in particularly Slovakia. even after 2011, when in all other countries, and to a lesser extent than the euro area, the ratio declined. Slovenia registered a lower rate of decline in this period. This indicator is household net financial assets to income ratio, and it's a combination of non-financial and financial account data. In the numerator is BF90, which is financial net worth. This is net financial assets, which is all financial assets minus all financial liabilities of the household at the end of the calendar year. Financial assets are things like cash or deposits or any financial instruments that the household has. The main financial liabilities of households are loans, mortgages, and delayed payments. This indicator is represented as a ratio to gross disposable income. It therefore represents the accumulation of financial assets households have after the deduction of liabilities as a proportion of their annual income. However, it does not take into account housing wealth, which at the very beginning we saw is a very big proportion of the total wealth of households. We have this indicator because it was developed a long time before the availability of housing wealth, which we call real wealth, became available. Here, when we look at this chart, we see the divergence of net financial assets ratio for the aggregate of the countries analyzed from the EU and the average, and the EA is indeed quite remarkable. For almost all of the analyzed countries except Hungary, Czechia, Slovenia, and recently Bulgaria, they are less than half the EA, and where available, the EU. Bulgaria's and Poland's ratio show the biggest rise over this period. The rising trend is visible for all countries except for Slovenia and Slovakia, which diverged most from the EU and the EA at the end of the period. So at the very beginning, I briefly spoke about the recent availability of non-financial statistics on assets which permit the calculation of household non-financial wealth, which was a very big proportion of the total wealth. It is therefore relevant to introduce a new indicator and that considers total wealth as computed the sum of financial and non-financial wealth, which we call real wealth, you see in the numerator. This indicator is very relevant for households, since their main liabilities are mortgages on dwellings, and they are subtracted from financial assets to compute financial net worth. This indicator here. The liabilities is basically a mortgage on a house. It's taken away from here. So not only is this relevant because you're deducing things like mortgages, it's also relevant because of the big component that real wealth has in total wealth of a household. The value of dwellings and land, just to remind you, is taken as a proxy for the household's non-financial wealth. Here, the net wealth ratio is compared with disposable income again. And here too, you see that the aggregate of the analyzed countries shows ratios below the EU and the EA averages. The only exception is this peak, which you cannot miss in Estonia between 2004 and 2006, the purple line. This was visible also in the investment rate, which we saw much earlier. But here, it is even more significant. The country with the lowest value on this indicator is Poland. But the value is not so low when only financial wealth was considered just before. For Latvia, the opposite applies. Its high share of real wealth places it higher than when the indicator is computed on the basis of financial wealth only. For all countries, this indicator is on an upward trend, as are the EU and the EA ratios. So to summarize what we saw, in general, the saving rates are increasing faster than the EU and the EA for the countries portrayed. I didn't show it in this presentation, but in the paper, we also looked at the structure of financial wealth. And the structure of financial wealth in the countries is converging on the EU and the EA portfolio composition. Also in the paper, which I didn't show here because it's a lot of numbers, per capita income and consumption in real terms are rising faster than the European average. So taking all of this together, it seems to indicate that households in the analyzed countries are not only using their growing available resources for consumption, but also to invest in real and financial assets. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Now Andrew again.
Okay, so again, I'd like to congratulate the authors on excellent paper, and also Eurostat for putting all this information into the public domain. It's the first time that we have all this extremely useful information on household financial situation in Central and Eastern Europe. And in particular, we have new data on household net wealth. I think that's a real advance. Now, the paper is largely a data paper. It has a lot on methodology and has a basic description of statistics. And it's not an analytical paper, and I think that's the next stage. And I'll give some ideas for exploring further the implications of these numbers. Now, in my presentation today, I first want to I have some comments on the paper, and I want to talk about issues on the database, and then finally I want to talk about a future research agenda in this area. So I have a lot to say, so that reason I think I'd be slower with a PowerPoint, so I'll just speak quickly. Okay, first off, in terms of how assets are, the definition of assets, I mentioned this to you yesterday. It's not clear if people in the UK have a house in southern France or Spain. Basically, those external assets are not included as a part of the domestic wealth of that household. And not maybe less a phenomenon in Eastern Europe, but you're really talking just about domestic assets, not the overall asset position of a household that has external assets. So I think that is maybe a limitation for certain countries. Another issue is you say that the paper that agricultural land is not owned by households. I didn't quite understand this because you're including unincorporated businesses as households, and are not farmers in most cases unincorporated business, and they own the land. So it seemed to me it wasn't clear why agricultural land was excluded as part of household wealth. Another issue is you have a set of countries in Central and Eastern Europe that include both Euro area countries like the Baltic countries or Slovenia and non-Euro. So it would be interesting to calculate the rates for the Euro countries and the non-Euro and see if there's any significant difference. Does having the Euro affect anything in terms of financial situation? Maybe not, but it would be an interesting kind of comparison. And I guess the key issue, is it good that the net household debt to GDP ratio is lower in the Central and Eastern Europe than the West? Because in the West, we talk about, problem with indebtedness. There's a recession, these people go bankrupt, that'll be bad for the economy. So really, is this a problem that there is basically less debt per capita on a household basis in the Central and Europe? I'm not sure of that. That's the question. Now then you talk about convergence, and you point out there are convergence in certain areas in terms of the savings rate, investment rate, and debt. Now, I guess the question is is there any evidence that there's financial intermediation function is becoming more sophisticated in Central and Eastern Europe relative to the West, and that explains it. So is this convergence linked to the development of the financial sector in the countries you analyzed? In terms of your data issues, again, I don't know if your data for the Central and Eastern European are weighted or unweighted. Now, the problem is, like Poland is a bit large country. The Baltic countries are very small. So if you have a total for that group, is it, I assume, it would be interesting to know, you could do both to see the sensitivity, but some of the big countries in that area might dominate the overall numbers. So I think both would be useful. That's always a question of whether you weight or unweight the data in terms of creating an aggregate. Also, I assume all your data is in nominal terms, but it wasn't clear, and then yet you have growth rates, and when you have growth rates, you want to have it in real terms. And again, I assume the growth rates of income are in real terms, but it wasn't always clear. Another issue would be good to put in averages, both the total period average and sub-period averages. You just have annual data, so I think that would help the paper. And then I get to the anomalies, and there's lots of them. Bulgaria, for example, had a savings rate of 44% in 1996. In 1997, the savings rate was 9%. That's a big decrease in savings. Is that just a problem with the data? And I guess whether you really should include data that you think is suspect in the database is a big issue. Another link to the data is that Poland has a very low household net wealth ratio. It's about 150%. Of net wealth as a share of GDP. All the other countries have 300% or more. So Poland seems to be an anomaly, not just the nature of the financial sector in Poland is less developed than the other countries. Also, some of the numbers seem completely unrealistic, particularly for Romania, which basically had a 14% increase in real adjusted disposable per capita income between 2003 and 2008. 14% a year. I don't even know if the Chinese made that. That's a very high rate of growth. The same thing for their consumption. It was increasing at 9% per year from basically 2000, 2008. Again, that's a very high growth rate. So I think maybe the Romanian data is questionable. Okay, turning now to your future research agenda. I'm sure you have one, and also you're a statistical office, so you may do less research in terms of these, understanding these than academics, but I think you should be aware of them, these issues. The first issue is, what is the link between the financial situation of households in Central and Eastern Europe and economic performance indicators, particularly, say, GDP growth or well-being indicators? How do these financial ratios contribute or not to the development of society? And linked to that, are there optimal ratios for financial household finances from the perspective of economic growth and well-being? We have a big debate in North America about indebtedness. Is it too high, too low, whatever? And linked to the optimal, are there danger or critical ratios? So if you go above this ratio, you're really in trouble as a country. I don't know. I think those are tricky issues, but it would be good to have some discussion on that. And then another issue is you have no data on distribution of assets. That wasn't the point. But that's obviously a next step, because it would be interesting to compare the top 1% share of wealth. I don't know if that's a topic that Eurostat would like to get into or not, but certainly you could compare the World Wealth Index that Piketty has developed with your data, and I think that would really be useful. So the bottom line is there's really a fantastic database here, and I think researchers will really find a lot of useful information there for their research. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, a very short question. Have you any indication whether this data on wealth stocks relate to the European Central Bank survey, this EHS, European Financial and Wealth Survey of Households? Just is an whether one can link this data or we can compare this data.
Other questions? Well, if not, maybe you can respond.
Okay, I'll answer the question first to the right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then you respond to Andrew.
I've written everything down.
Okay, good.
I'll try and be very fast, even faster than you maybe. There are many expert groups between Eurostat, the ECB, and the OECD, which are working on linking data. So yes, it is a future project, yeah. I mean, is it possible now? I mean, the studies that have been done show that the links are not very good, but a framework is being developed. Okay. So thank you very much for your discussion. On your first question, the way assets are calculated in the national accounting framework means that, okay, let's take me as an example. I live in Luxembourg, I own a house in Luxembourg, and I own a house also in Croatia, which is my origin. But in national accounting framework for my non-financial wealth, housing wealth, only my house in Luxembourg is considered. My house in Croatia goes as an unincorporated enterprise in the non-financial, in S11, which is another sector. So it's counted, but it's not counted as the resident household sector. And that's because that's the way the methodological framework of national accounting is. Agricultural land is included. So we use dwellings and land has dwellings underlining land under it. Because again, in national accounting framework, you need to divide between produced and non-produced assets. So this bit is included, and apologies for not making it clear in the paper. Yes, definitely, it would be interesting to compare non-EU and EU for future work, to separate, to see, because I showed you the European area, maybe to see what the non-European area looks like. Is it good that debt to income is low? It's a good idea that you gave me for a next paper that I could work on for the next conference. In terms of data issues, you mentioned many. You mentioned Bulgaria. You mentioned Poland. This is a data quality issue with these countries, and sometimes we have available data in our database, and sometimes we don't. I mean, we check for consistency and for plausibility of data. And what you saw in the paper is not on the database. It's cut out. We put it in because, so it's difficult as Eurostat when a statistical office has done a lot of work sometimes to cut them out. Because we try to be supportive and we try to help so that eventually we arrive to a state when we will have good quality available data so that we can construct more indicators which are used for further studying. The aggregates in the paper are done as averages, but on our Eurostat website, it's actually an aggregation method, which is done by weighting. So in the charts, in the paper, it's arithmetic averages, but Eurostat does an aggregation method. We have a team dedicated which does the European Union aggregates, and the European Central Bank does the Euro area aggregates. And then you gave me 3 very good ideas for future papers. Thank you very much. The financial structure in CEE countries and economic performance indicator. Then I think that would be the next step to analyze. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah.
Is there any chance of including the external assets, like the second home? I mean, you say you just put somewhere else, but that might also be an additional, just for the analysis purposes.
No, it wouldn't be possible. It's impossible to find. It's very difficult to separate, first of all, unincorporated enterprises, quasi-corporations, which are included in households or in other sectors, such as financial companies or non-financial companies. It's virtually impossible because of the individual laws which are governed in every country and how they do this. Yes, we would get to a much better estimate of non-financial wealth for houses, but it's, by the way in which the framework is done, it's virtually impossible. Yeah.
So how about households that own businesses? I guess you're treating this as like a business that they own, right? Does that mean all the directly owned businesses are excluded, which could be a huge amount of wealth for a lot of people?
No. Unincorporated enterprises are included in households. And precisely the reason they are included is because if you're an uncorporated enterprise and you're declaring bankruptcy, before you declare bankruptcy, they're going to take things away from your house. They're going to come and take your TV, your chair, and everything. And so it is included. And it is included in the wealth. Yeah, by national accounting. It was in that slide which I skipped because I was afraid we would get into a very complicated methodological debate. But to answer your question short, it's included, yes.
Okay, so I guess I would like to thank the presenters and also especially Andrew as a discussant.